No, I did. I just got mine.
So you left her, you knew you were leaving early. I had to leave early because of Holy Day. Oh, so you knew at least. Plan for it.
No,
Yeah, it passes.
you see?
Hold those fingers.
What's that direction though?
Okay, that's fine.
Forward.
Okay. Now I can't see. I can't see the E.
So you can see that, and that's the right.
I have to. I have to.
Yeah, you see, right?
You know, I was saying to them today, I said, you know, I do need to get these surgeries yesterday. But I don't have money. I actually did. So we go back and forth. I did say that he got my recommendation. It is, but right now we're messed up just because of the directly eyes are so different. And I may not be my glasses may not like good eye. I'm just gonna do that to my glasses and the eye. We'll figure it out. Yeah, I'm not gonna get confused yet. It's so clever. So right now, she's gonna use the glasses after eating or things like that. Maybe not like that. But you know. That's kind of what there's to, yeah, well, we're also working on right now. If I go to we'll have to have that. I worked for the agency until about 3 years ago when they didn't know what the Bible was. No longer really working on it. So yeah, I rolled into 3 years. And now my students will have to reach the village. I should have. Did you work in contact now? No. I had cataract surgery this week. So I didn't have to. All the cool girls are having cataract surgery. But,
Yeah, I took off the coat. You don't need that.
but it is.
Yeah, you might want to tell people out.
Yes. It's nice to see you. Thank you. Oh, I never watch services on the live stream. Do you watch it on live stream?
No, but I sometimes go to a friend's house and they will get it on the last one. And it kind of has faith in them, but they don't believe the way I believe.
So they got you. So
Yeah, well, yes.
I mean, watching the live stream is like pretty. It's different.
It's just totally different.
Yeah, and to me, I'm glad it works for those who really works.
Well, I can't say it really works for me, because it doesn't, but if I'm in situations where my writing is fun, or I have to work a lot, and the only reason I can do that is usually, you know.
Good morning and good Shabbos to everyone. We are Congregation Agudat Achim on the live stream and in person. It is 9:15, but we are still assembling our minion here. We're going to wait a few more minutes before we get started, but those of you who are joining us electronically, good to see you here this morning. It'll be just a few minutes before we get started.
It's so good to see you.
It's 7 and Joe will be here at 8. We're keeping up on it.
Hey, Shabbat Shalom.
Here's Joe. Rosh Chodesh Av coming this week, so we can, push that. Page 99. Start with Andy.
It's on 103. I don't usually slip it through, but yeah, just put the brick on the shop. Here comes somebody else.
We're getting close. It's one person will be 9, right?
Yep. All right, I think we can do it.
Good morning, good Shabbos, everyone.
Shabbat shalom.
Welcome to Agudat Achim services by in person or by live stream. I am Steve Schmidt. I'm the president of the congregation, and I will be pretending to be the rabbi today. Rabbi Spitzer, if you're watching, and nice to have you here. Nice to have you this way. We are going to begin in just a moment with the blessing for the new day, which is found on page 103 of Siddur Lev Shalem, the new red one that we'll be using to call pages this morning. Art Friedson is our Shachrit leader, and I will turn matters over to him.
Okay. Please rise. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lesech vivina lach ben yom uven laila. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asani b'tzalmo. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asani ben chorin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asani Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam pokeach ivrim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam malbi sharumim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam matir asurim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam zokev kifufim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam rakaretz halamayim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam amechin mitzadei gaver. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasali kotzorki. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam ozer Yisrael bigvura. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam oter Yisrael b'tifara. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam anoten layav koach. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamevir sheina meyanai b'ntum navi apapayin. Utnenu hayom v'choyom l'cheinu l'chesed l'rachamim b'yenecha v'necha ro'enu v'tigmalenu chasadim tovim baruch atah Adonai gomel chasadim tovim le'amo Yisrael le'olam yehi adam yirei shamayim b'seiter v'galui u'model ha'emet ribon kol amim lo tzikadkeinu anachnu mapilim taknunenu lefanecha ma'anachnu ma'chayinu ma'chastenu ma'tzikenu ma'yishenu ma'kolkenu ma'goretenu. Ashreinu ma tov chelkenu manim goraleinu ma yafa Yerushatenu. Ashreinu she'anachnu mashkimim arivim erev avoker romim pamayim bechol yom. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Kadesh Chimcha Makdashe Shemecha V'Kadesh Chimcha Bolamecha Uvishuatcha Tarim V'Tagbiya Karnenu Baruch Ata Adonai Mekadesh Chimcha Barabim. Page 120. Mizmor Shir Chanukah Bayit LeDavid Aromim Kandid Litani V'Lasem Magdoy Mali Shivati Alech V'Tirpeini and I Mishal Navshi Hayitan Miyar Divorce Amr He starts off on a fucked up, he's made a call, but tak simcha. Leman yazamercha chavod velo yidom. Adonai Elohai le'olam odeka. We rise on page 122. Baruch Shamar v'haya ha'olam Baruch Hu. Baruch Oseh Bereshit, Baruch Omer v'Yoseh, Baruch Gozer u'Mekayem, Baruch Merachem al haaretz, Baruch Merachem al habriot, Baruch Mishalem Sachar Tov l'Reav, Baruch Chai la'ad v'Kayam la'netzach, Baruch Podeh u'Matzil, Baruch Shemo, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam ha'elav v'Rachaman hamulah b'fi amo mishubakim forad v'shalom. Yachid Cheolamim Melech Mishubakum for Deyat Shemo Agado Baruch Ata Adonai Melech Mechulal Batishbachot. Can be seated. We continue on 123. Hodu Ladonai Kiru Vishmo Hodio Bamim Alilotav Shiru Lo Zamru Lo Sicho Vichoni Flotav Hidalu B'Shem Kosho Yismach Lev Mivarshem. Ki ko Elohei amim elolim v'nai shamayim asa hod v'hadar lefanav oz v'hed v'abim komo havu l'Adonai mishpachot amim havu l'Adonai b'kavod v'oz havu l'Adonai kavod shemo yismachu hashamayim v'tagei ha'aretz yiram hayam u'moloa hodu l'Adonai ki tov ki l'olam chasdo v'yoshienu. Ramamu Adonai Eloheinu v'ishtachavu l'adom raglav kadoshu. Ramamu Adonai Eloheinu v'ishtachavu l'har kodsho ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu. V'hurachum yechaper avon v'lo yashchit v'yirba l'ashiva po v'lo yirkol chamato. At Adonai lo tichaver. Adonai tzvot ashreidam boteach bach. Adonai Hoshia melech yanenu biyom korenu.
Middle of page 126.
Hoshia damecha v'rechet nachlatecha urein v'nasem ad haolam. Nafshenu hiktal Adonai ezreinu. V'ani b'chastecha batakti yagel libi b'shuatecha ashiro l'Adonai ki gamal alai. Lamanat seach mizmor David hashamayim misarprim kavodeo umasei yadam magia harakia yom li yom yabia omer v'layla layla. Yula ratzoni mefi v'gyon libi lefanecha Adonai tzuri v'go ali. LeDavid bishnoto ki atamot elevnei Avimelech v'yigarshehu vayelech avarcha et Adonai b'cholei tamiti lato b'fi Adonai tithaleu nafshi ze'ani karaza yiru et Adonai koshem mi ha'yishech hafetz chayim oev yamim l'rotov Yasur meira v'yasei tov b'kei shalom v'rodfehu Einei Adonai al tzadikim v'yazno Podeh Adonai nefesh avada v'lo yeshmu kol hachosim bo Tefillah Moshe ish Elohim Adonai ma'on atachayita lanu bedor vador Teshev enosh adam Shuv Adonai ad matai V'hino am Adonai Eloheinu aleinu masei yadenu konena aleinu masei yadenu konenehu Yoshe b'seter elyon b'tzel Shaddai yitlonan Omar Adonai machsi u'mitzudati Eloheinu v'takbo Orach yami masbiyo v'yareyu b'shuati. Orach yami masbiyo v'yareyu b'shuati. Hallelujah, hallelujah, et Shem Adonai, hallelujah, avdei Adonai. Shomdim b'veit Adonai b'chatzrot beit Eloheinu. Hallelujah, ki tov Adonai, zamer lo shmo, ki kol shir chafetz Adonai l'zeh. Atzbata be'ei hagoyim kesef v'zaham. Beit Yisrael Baruch Hu ad Adonai, Beit Aaron Baruch Hu ad Adonai, Beit Alevi Baruch Hu ad Adonai, Yirei Adonai Baruch Hu ad Adonai, Baruch Adonai Mitzyon Shochem Yerushalayim. Hallelujah. We rise on 132. Hodu l'Adonai ki tov, ki le'olam chasto. Hodu l'Elohei Elohim, ki le'olam chasto. Hodu l'Adonai Adonim, ki le'olam chasto. Le'oseni flot gedolo levado, ki le'olam chasto. Le'ozer shamayim bidvuna, ki le'olam chasto. Le'orkaretz alamayim, ki le'olam chasto. Malach Amova min bar kilam kastol makay malachim gedolim Sichon melach Amarik lemasol yog melach Abashan kilam kastol natan artsam lenachala kilam Noten lacham lechol basar kileolam chasto hodu leil hashamayim kileolam chasto. Can be seated. Rananu tzadikim badonai la yashrim navati la. Hodu l'Adonai b'chinor b'nei v'lasor l'amru lo shiru shiru lo shir chadash. Nafshenu hiktal Adonai Ezreinu maginenu hu ki vo yismach libenu ki b'shem koshenu bataknu yehichastecha Adonai aleinu kasher yechalnu lach mizmor shir liyom haShabbat tov l'Adonai l'zamer shimcha l'yon lagid baboker chastecha b'yamuncha b'leilot alei Hashem simach tani Adonai b'fo alecha. Odin avon b'seva d'shenim v'rananim yiyu lagik yashar Adonai tzuri v'lo avla tabo Adonai malach yud lavesh lavesh Adonai ozit hazar avtikon tevel batimot nachon kisacham eyaz me'olamatan masu Adonai nasu narat nakolam yisu naradoch yam mikolam mayim rabim adirim mishperiyam adir b'marom Adonai Edotech anemnu mivod levetcha nava kodesh Adonai le'orech yamim Yichvod Adonai le'olam yismach Adonai b'ma'asav Yishem Adonai mevarach mi'atavi ad olam Mimizrah shemesh ad mevovom b'kol Hashem Adonai V'hu rachum yechaper avon v'lo yashchit, v'yarbal hashiva pov lo yerko chamato, Adonai Yoshia melech yanenu b'yom korenu.
Ashrei on page 136.
Ashrei yoshvei veitecha, od yalu chasela. Ashrei am shekachalo. Tila the David armim chal hayam melech, v'chashim chal yom ved, b'chol yom avracheka. Tol shemach masech, avrot yagidu adar. Poteach et yadecha, masbir harason, tzadikanai b'chol draka, v'chasid b'chol masav. Tilad anai yadaber pi v'varech kol basar shem kodsho le'olam va'ed, v'anachnu v'arech yamei ata b'yad olam. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Halli nafshi et Adonai. Halli Adonai b'chayai. Azamra Elohei be'odi. Ashrei Adonai Yaakov. Adonai shomer kerim yatom v'yamana yoded v'derech yibrishaim yaved yimloch Adonai le'olam el hayatzion l'dor v'ador. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Ki tov zamra Eloheinu ki na'im nava tehillah. Bonei Yerushalayim Adonai nidchei Yisrael yechanes harofim. Shavku Yerushalayim Adonai. Magi devarav liYaakov ukav mishpatav liYisrael lo asachein lechol goyim mishpatim bal yedaum. Hallelujah. 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 Adonai min hashamayim. Hallelujah. Bamromim. Hallelujah. Kol malachav. Hallelujah. Kol tzavav. Hallelujah. Shemesh v'yareach. Hallelujah. Kol kochvei or. Vayarm karen li'amoti la l'chol chasidav livnei Yisrael am karovo. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Shir l'nai shir chadash tilato b'chal chasidim. Yismach Yisrael b'yosa b'nei Tzion yagilu milachav. Le'sor malchechem b'zikim b'nevchechem b'chavlei varzel la'asot b'hem mishpat katuv hadar v'chol l'chol chasidav. Hallelujah.
Top of page 141, Psalm 150.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah. B'kodsho. Hallelujah. B'kiyauzo. Hallelujah. V'gvurotav. Hallelujah. B'kirov gudlo. Hallelujah, b'teka shofar, hallelujah, b'nevel v'chinor, hallelujah, b'tofu machol, hallelujah, b'minim v'yugav, hallelujah, b'tziltzalei shama, hallelujah, b'tziltzalei trua, kol anshamat halel yah, hallelujah, kol anshamat halel yah, hallelujah, Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen v'amen. Baruch Adonai Mitzion Shochen Yerushalayim Hallelujah. Baruch Adonai Elohim Eloi Yisrael Oseniv Lo Levado. Uvaruch Shen Kvodo Le'olam. V'yimalech Vodo et Kol Haaretz. Amen v'amen. We rise on 142. Vayavarech David Adonai Li'nei Kol HaKahal Vayomer David. Baruch Atah Adonai Elohei Yisrael Avinu Me'olam v'yad olam ad lecha Adonai Hagdula Hagura Tiferet V'netzach V'hod Yod. Atahu Adonai levadecha. Atahu Adonai Elohim asher bacharta bi'Avram v'otzeito mirkastim v'samta shmo Avraham u'matzata levavo neman lefanecha v'charod imo habrit la'ted eretz haKnani haKhiti haMori haPerizi haYebusi haGirgashi la'ted l'ziru. V'hayam bakata livnehem v'yavru b'toch hayam b'yabasha v'yet rofeim mishlachtavim solot kamo even b'mayim azim v'yosha Adonai b'yom hahu et Yisrael miyam Mitzrayim v'yar Yisrael Mitzrayim made al sfat hayam v'yar Yisrael yagedola asher asanai b'Mitzrayim v'yum Adonai v'yaminu b'Adonai v'Moshe avdo Az Yashir Moshe b'nei Yisrael את השירה הזאת לאדוני, ויאמר לאמור השירה לאדוני כי גוגו סוסו רחמה בים, עוזי וזמרת שווה לישוע אז לביהו וימיהו ונשמע כבוד. מי כמוך ומי כמוך נראה בקודש, נראתי לא תוספה לעני. כי לאדוני המלוכה משה בגויים ויעלו משה בארציון לשפוט ארציו, ויטל אדוני המלוכה, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא הנה אחד ושמו אחד. Can be seated. נשמת כל חי, תברך את שמך, אדוני אלוהינו. ורוח כל בשר תפאר ותרומם זכרך מלכנו תמיד מן העולם ועד עולם אתה יום מבלעדיך אילנו מלך כל השם. ילופינו מלא שירם קיים לשוננו. ממצרים גאלתנו אדוני אלוהינו מבית עבדים בדיתנו. Lock me, Yeshua, lock me, Anybody else out there, Jeff? Does that mean yes or no? This isn't on very high. Can we turn that up a little?
It's set for rabbi.
נהלל חנר שבח ונפארך ונברך את שם קודשך כאמור לדוד ברכי נפשי את אדוני וכל קרבי את שם קודשו האל בתעצומות עוזך הגדול בכבוד שמך הגיבור לנצח ונורא בנורותיך המלך היושב על כיסא רם ונישא.
Shokain Ad is on page 147 in the middle.
שוכן עד מרום וקדוש שמו וכתוב רנו צדיקים באדוני לישרים נבעתי לה בפי ישרים תתהלל ובדברי צדיקים תתברך ובלשון חסידים תתרומם ובקרב קדושים תתקדש ומקלות רבבות עמך בית ישראל. ברינה יתפאר שמך מלכנו בכל דור ודור, שכן חובת כל יצורים לפניך, אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, להודות, להלל, לשבח, לפאר, לרומם, להדר, לברך, להלל ולקלס, על כל דברי שירות ותשבחות, דוד בן ישי, עבדך משיחך, ישתבח שמך לעד מלכנו. El HaMelech HaGadol VaHaKadosh B'Shamayim U'Va'aretz Ki Lecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu Shir U'Shvacha Halev V'Zimra Ozu Memshala Netzach Gidula Gvura Tila V'Tiferet Kedusha U'Malchut Brachot V'Hodaot Me'ata V'Ad Olam Baruch Ata Adonai El Melech Gadol Batishbachot El HaHodaot Adon HaNiflaot Habocher B'Shirei Zimra Melech Elchei HaOlamim Yikada v'yikada Shemei Rabbah V'yalama divarach Hirutei v'yamlich malchutei V'chayechon u'vyomechon u'v'chayedecho Beit Yisrael Bagala v'zman kariv v'yimeru Amen Yehei Shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam le'omei omaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudesha brichu le'la min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechamata damiran be'alma v'yimeru Amen.
The Baruch Hu is on page 149.
Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Le'olam va'ed Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Yotzei or v'orei choshech oseh shalom u'vorei et hakol Hakol yoducha v'hakol yishabchucha v'hakol yomerin kadosh kadonai. En kerkachadnu elenu ba'olam hazeh v'ein zulatcha malkeinu lechaye ha'olam haba Efes biltecha go aleinu limod ha'mashiach v'ein domeh lecha moshienu litchiyat ha'metim El Adonai kol ha'masim baruch u'mvorach b'fi kol neshama Godlo v'tuvo malei olam da'at udvuna sovev imoto hamit goe achayot hakodesh v'nedar b'chavod ala merkava zechut u'mishor lifnei chiso chesed v'rachamim lifnei chevodo tovim meyorot shebara Eloheinu yitzaram b'dat b'vina uvaskel koach ugvura natan bahen la'yot moshlim b'kerev tevel meleim ziv u'mefikim noga no'ezivam b'chol ha'olam smechim b'tzeitam v'sasim b'voam osim b'yem aritzon konam Pe'er v'chavod notnim lishmo Tzol averin al zecher machuto Kara la shemesh v'yizrachor Ra v'hikin surat alvana Shevach notnim lo Kol tzeva marom Tiferet ugedula Serafim v'yofanim v'chayot hakodesh Leil asher Shabbat mikol ha'masim bayom hashvi'i halev yashav al kisei kvodo tiferet atar liyom menucha yonei kara liyom shem. Titbarak Mosheinu Hashavak Masei Yadecha v'yomer or shasita yifarucha sela Titbarak Sureinu Malkeinu v'go aleinu Berei Kedoshim, Yishtabach Shimcha Lo'ad Malkeinu, Yotzei Meshartim, Eser Mesharta, Kulam Ahuvim, Kulam Berurim, Kulam Giborim, V'kulam Osim Be'ema, U'v'yira Ritzon Konam, וכולם פותחים את פיהם בקדושה ובתורה, בשירה ובזמרה, ומברכים ומשבחים, ומפרים ומרצים ומקדישים וממליכים את שם האל המלך הגדול, הגיבור הקדוש הוא. וכולם מקבלים עליהם או מלכות שמיים זה מזה, ונותנים רשות זה לזה להקדיש ליוצרם בנחת רוח, בשפה ורב נימה, קדושה כולם כאחד, עונים ואומרים ביראה, קדוש, 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 אדוני צבאות, מלוך על הארץ כבודו. ואופנים וחיות הקודש, בראש גדול מנסים לעומת שרפים, לעומתם משבחים ואומרים, ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו. ליאל ברוך נימות שיתנו למלך חי וקיים, זאת יאמרו תשבות ישמיעו. המחדש בטובו בכל יום תמיד, מעשה בראשית כאמור, לעושה אורים גדולים, כי לעולם חסדו. אור חדש על ציון תאיר, ונזכה כולנו מהרה לאורו. ברוך אתה אדוני, יוצר המאורות.
Second bracha before the Shema is at the top of page 154.
Ava Rabav Tanu Adonai Eloheinu Chem Lagidol Avetera Chamalto Aleinu Avinu Malkeinu Ba'avor Avotenu Shebatchu V'cha Avinu Malkeinu Vatilamdem Chukei Chaim, Kein Tichonenu Tilamdenu, Havinu Ha'av Arachaman, Hamrachim Rachim Aleinu, V'tein B'libenu Lehavin, L'haskil Lishmoa, Lil Lamodu, Lil Lamed, Lishmor V'lasod, U'lekayim et kol divrei Talmud, Toratecha b'yava, V'ha'erinenu b'toratecha, v'dabek libenu b'mitzvotecha, v'yached levavenu, li'ahava u'l'yira et shemecha, v'lo nevosh le'olam va'ed, v'lo nevosh le'olam va'ed, Ki v'shem kodshecha hagadol v'hanora batachnu nagila v'nismecha b'shuatecha v'havienu l'shalom me'arba kanfot ha'aretz v'tolichenu komemiyut Komemiyud le'artseinu, ki el poel Yeshua data, uvanu v'charta mikolam v'lashon, v'keirav tanu l'shimcha hagadol, sela sela be'yemet, Lodod lecha u'yachetcha b'yahava, Baruch atah Adonai, Abocher b'yamo Yisrael b'yahava. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai echad. V'yahavta et Adonai Elohecha, b'chol levavcha, v'chol nafshecha, v'chol me'odecha, v'hayu hadvarim ha'ele, asher anochi mitzavcha, hayom al levavecha, v'shinantam levanecha, v'dibarta bam, v'shiftecha b'veitecha, v'olektecha v'derech, uv'shochbecha uv'kumecha, ukshartam leot al yadecha, v'hayu letotafot beinenecha, uktavtam al mezuzot beitecha uv'isharecha, v'haya'im shema v'tishma mitzvotay Hashem. L'man yibu yamecha v'necha Vayomer Adonai Moshe lemor davar L'man tizkuru v'yasitem et kol mitzvotai v'tem kedoshim l'Elohechem ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim liot lachem l'Elohim ani Adonai Elohechem Adonai Elohechem emet v'yatziv v'nachon v'kayam v'yashar v'nemaru L'dor v'adoro kayam u'shmo kayam v'chison achonu malchuto v'emunato lad kayamet u'dvarav chayim v'kayamim nemani v'nechamadim liad u'lamei olamim hamadim Emet shatahu Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu malkeinu melech avotenu golena goel avotenu yotzreinu tzur yeshuatenu podenu matzilenu me'olam shemecha ein Elohim zulatecha Ezrat avotenu atahu me'olam Magenu Moshiach Brumala Moshe v'acha mishpatecha v'zikat seyaris Mitzrayim galtanu, Adonai Eloheinu mipid avadim b'ditanu. Ram v'nisa gadol v'nora mashpil geim u'magbiya shefalim motzi asirim ufode anavim v'yozer dalim Vion Eliamo, B'yet Shava Melav, Tilot Le'el Elyon, Baruch Hu Mevorach, Moshe U'vnei Yisrael, Lechanu Shira, B'simcha Rabba, V'yamru Chulam, Mi Chamocha Bo'elim Adonai, Mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh norati lo tosei fele shira chadasha shibchu gilim l'shimcha svatayam yachad kulam hodu v'imlichu v'yamru Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed tzur Yisrael kuma b'ezrat Yisrael Uvdechinu mecha Yehuda v'Yisrael Go aleinu Adonai tzevaot shemo Kedosh Yisrael Baruch atah Adonai Gal Yisrael.
The Amidah begins on page 159.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah Ha'el HaGadol, HaGibor v'Hanora, El Elyon Gomel Chasadim Tovim v'Konei HaKol v'Zocher Chastei Avot Umevi goel livnei v'neihem leman shemo b'yava melech ozer ufokedu Moshiach umagen Baruch atah Adonai magen Avraham ufoked Sarah atah gibor le'olam Adonai mechayei metim atarav lo'shia mechalkel chayim b'chesed Mechayei metim v'rachamim rabim Somek noflim v'rofei cholim Umatir asurim Umekayem emunato lishenei afar Micha mocha bal givurot Umido melach melech meimit umechayeh umatzmiach Yeshua v'neman ata lachayot metim baruch ata Adonai mechayeh hametim nekadesh et shimcha ba'olam kishem shemakti shimoto b'shmei marom kakatuv ya niviecha v'karazel zevi amar kadosh 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 Adonai tzvaot melech kol haaretz kvodo az b'kol rash gadol Adir v'chazak mashmim kol mitnasim liumat serafim liumatam baruch yomeru baruch kevod Adonai mimkomcha malkeinu tofia v'timloch aleinu ki mechakim anachnu lach Matai timloch b'tzion b'kara b'yameinu le'olam va'ed tishkon tikada v'tikadash b'toch Yerushalayim ircha Ledor vador l'netzach netzachim V'einenu tirena malchutecha Kadavar ha'amur b'shirei uzecha Ayedei David Mashiach tzidkecha Imloch Adonai le'olam Elohai Sion Ledor vador hallelujah Ledor vador nagid god lecha U'lenetzach netzachim kedushatcha nakdish V'shivchacha Eloheinu mipinu lemush le'olam va'ed Ki el melech gadol v'kadosh ata Baruch ata Adonai ha'el ha'kadosh
If you are still completing your Amidah, please do so. Otherwise, we turn to page 167 for Kaddish Shalem.
Yikadav Yikadash Shmei Rabbah, V'yamad Yivrach Yerutei V'yamlich Malchutei B'chayei Chon V'yomei Chon V'chayei D'chol Beit Yisrael B'galav Yizman Kari V'yimeru. Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach Le'olam Le'omei Omaya. Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitpar V'yitruman V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitalev V'yitalal Shemei D'Kudashah B'richu Le'olam Min Kol Birchata V'shirata Tushvachata V'nechamata Damram B'yama V'yimeru. Amen. Tikal Bal Tzlot Hon V'hon Kol Yisrael Kodam Avon V'yishmaya V'yimeru. Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabbah Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu V'kol Yisrael V'yimeru. Amen. Oseh Shalom B'imromav V'yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'yimeru. Amen.
At this point, we turn back in the prayer book to page 112 for the Psalm for Shabbat.
Hayom Yom Shabbat Kodesh Shebo Hayelavim Om Beit Amikdash Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbat Tov Lo Adonai Lo Zamer Shimcha Leyon Lagid Baboker Chastecha V'Mincha B'Leilot Alei Asor V'Alei Neve Alei Ki Samachtani Adonai B'Fo Alecha B'Masei Yodecha Arnein. Odinavum b'seivadishinim v'rananim yiyu lagid ki ashar Adonai tzuri v'lo avlatabo.
Mourner's Kaddish is found on page 124. Those who are in mourning or observing a yard site, please rise, turn to page 121 and join art.
Yikadal v'yikadash shemei rabbah v'yalma divrach yerutei v'yamlich malchutei V'chayei chon u'v'yomei chon u'v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael b'galav yizman kari v'imru. Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach Le'olam Le'omei Omaya. Yiparach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal Shemei D'Kudashah B'richu Le'ela Min Kol Birchata V'shirata Tushbechata V'nechamata Damiran B'alma V'imru. Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabbah Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru. Amen. Oseh Shalom B'imromav V'yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru. Amen.
Good morning, good Shabbos. Welcome to Congregation Agudat Achim. Those of you who are joining us in person today, those of you who are joining us by live stream, welcome. In just a moment, we're going to take out the Torah for the Torah service. We are on page 168. Before I do that, I'm going to remind people that although we have the good fortune that we are still in a low transmission area, we are still making some accommodations to the pandemic in our rituals. The most important of these is that we will lift the Torah scroll before we do the reading, and this is an opportunity for anybody who is going to have an aliyah but would prefer not to come up to the bima to be able to see the text of the scroll that's going to be read before it's read. If you would like to have your aliyah from the bima, you are welcome to come up and join us. We ask that you go down immediately after your aliyah so that we don't have more people congregating on the bima than required. If you would prefer to take your aliyah at the base of the scroll, the base of the bima instead, on the side microphone, you can do that. Art is verifying that it will work for you. And we will do the Torah parade, and we will come through the congregation with the scroll, but we ask that people remain at their seats and that they not congregate towards the Torah to touch or kiss it, because that is still something we're not quite prepared to resume doing. That is how we're going to do things today. As the pandemic evolves, it may change, but that's this week's rules. We join Art on page 168 for the Shabbat Torah service.
En kamocha v'Elohim Adonai v'en kemasecha malchutecha malchut kol olamim umemshaltecha b'chol dor v'dor Adonai melech Adonai malach Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed Adonai oz le'amo yitein Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom havarachamim hetiv avirtzoncha et Sion tivneh chomot Yerushalayim tivneh chomot Yigvid batachnu melech el ram v'nisa Adon Olamim. Please rise. Vayehi Beito Aaron, Vayomer Moshe, Uma Adonai, Ve'yafutzu Ovecha, Ve'yanusu Misanecha Mipanecha, Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah, Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah, Udevar Adonai Mirushalayim, Baruch Shenatan Torah, Torah, Baruch Shenatan Torah, Torah, Le'amo Yisrael B'kedushato, B'rik Shemein Mariama B'kitra Yachrakim. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shema. Gadol Adonai Iti, Unaromima Shema Yaakov. Ve'hatiferet, ve'hanetzach, ve'hahod, ki cho b'shamayim u'va'aretz, lecha Adonai hamamlacha, ve'hamitnase lecho lerosh, romemu, 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 Adonai Eloheinu, ve'ishtachavu, ve'ishtachavu, Adom raglav kadoshu, romemu, romemu, Adonai Eloheinu, ve'ishtachavu, ve'ishtachavu, le'har kodsho ki kadosh, Adonai Eloheinu. You may be seated. Our Torah is down and ready to be read. Oh, we're going to stand up? Oh, that's right. We're going to lift first.
As previously
So we
announced,
rise for, as previously announced. Be seated. Now we'll cover the scroll. Has anyone assigned the aliyot? That has happened. Fantastic. All right. Our portion for today is Pinchas. Pinchas is one of those portions which is somewhat oddly named because the action of the story has already happened in last week's reading, and we pick up just as the event has happened and everybody is waiting to find out what will happen because something rather dramatic has occurred. A couple of people were very badly misbehaving. They've been killed for it. What's God going to do about this? And the answer is that God is going to give Pinchas, hence the name of the portion, the covenant of peace, the Brit Shalom. And Precisely what a breach shalom is, or why Pinchas should merit it in return for this action, is something that the commentators wrestle with. The Eitz Chaim, which follows the suggestion of Ibn Ezra, is that this is because Pinchas fears retributions from the survivors, the family of the people he's killed, which is consonant with the rules about retribution that we're going to read in the portion this week. That's not the only way you can read it. Rashi says that it's Hashem's peace, that Pinchas is going to go to peace with God because God is very grateful that this was done. Sforno, an Italian commentator, says he was rewarded with long life. He was given peace. The angel of death couldn't come after him. And other sources say, well, he was a priest, there was this dead body here, they're not supposed to do that. So he was informed that he wouldn't be punished for having come into contact with a dead body, which a priest is not supposed to do. Nachmanides has a reading which goes a little bit different direction, which is that Pinchas's action has revealed a flaw in Pinchas's nature. Pinchas is a violent person. And in this particular instance, that was a good thing because he took an action that needed to be taken. But in general, this marks out Pinchas as a dangerous person. And the idea of giving him a covenant of peace, and particularly in pushing him into the priesthood, is to limit his scope and make sure that he will be confined or controlled in a way that this violent action of his, this violent nature of his, will not express itself at a later time, which it might not be appropriate. They proceed from the end of the episode of Pinchas to take a census, and they discover that no one who had come out of Egypt, except for Caleb and Yehoshua, is still alive, which means that they have reached the end of the 40 years and they can go into the land. This makes it important to start thinking about the settlement of the land and who's going to get to live where. And that's why it's at this moment that the daughters of Zelophehad, who want to claim a portion in the land for themselves because their father, who would otherwise have gone into the land, had no male offspring, they say, hey, what about our portion? If they don't ask for it now, the land is going to be given to somebody else. So they do. It's found through Moses that God blesses this idea and says, yes, you should do this. And so that gets established. Moses, however, is told, you don't get any because you're not going in. This is when God summons Moses and says, now that it's time for the people Israel to enter the land and settle it, you are not part of that because of your error at the wilderness of Sin. And Moses could protest against this. In the Midrashim, we do see some dialogue between Moses and God saying, really? And God saying, yes, really. But in the text, we don't see that. What we see is Moses saying, someone has to take over for me. Someone has to become the leader of the people if it's not going to be me anymore. And God says, yes, you're right, we have to do that. He approached Joshua to take over as Moses' successor, but he changes the rules of leadership a little bit. And it's at this point that this reading reminded me of one of our congregants we lost this week, Stephen Schechter. Stephen was a political scientist by training and vocation, and he and I and others who are here interacted regularly at the men's club Torah study. And one of the things that Stephen always would talk about when it came up in the portion is the question of the political organization of the Jewish people. They need a leader. At some level, God is the leader, but that doesn't work out on a day-to-day basis. There are always some institutions for political processes around the Jewish people. And this is essentially the first of those political moments, that suddenly Moses is not going to be here, and we have to come up with some rules about the leadership. And on the one hand, Joshua takes over as Moses' successor, but there's a shift in the power structure, that the appointment of Joshua has to be confirmed. He has to be charged with the job by the priesthood. The Kohen Gadol has to appoint him to this position. And it represents a shift in power between the prophet, Moses, who has not been constrained in this way. Subsequently, the prophetic leader is going to have to share power with the priesthood in some way. And Steve Schechter was a big student of federalism and the way that power is shared in political democratic institutions. And as I was reviewing this portion, I had that moment of thinking of Steve. May his memory be for a blessing. The rest of the chapter after that is mostly the establishment of the sacrificial rules for Shabbat, the daily offering, Rosh Chodesh, and all of the festivals. And all of our reading will come from that. So we're going to pick up the subject at that point, and we are going to turn to page 931 for the first Aliyah, chapter 29, verse 16.
ויעזור ויגן וחושב וחוסן בו ונאמר
Amen.
הכל אלוהינו נקבל לתורה בנהילת הכהן הראשונה תעמוד לילה ברוך שנתן תורה לעמו ישראל בקדושתו
Baruch hu et Adonai habarach. Baruch Adonai habarach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'char excuse me. Bonu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Amen. ובחודש הראשון ב-14 יום לחודש פסח לאדוני וב-15 יום לחודש הזה חג 7 ימים מצות יאכל ביום הראשון מקרא קודש כל מלאכת עבודה לא תעשו והקרבתם משעולה לאדוני פרים בני בקר 2 ואיל 1 ו7 כבשים בני שנה תמימים יהיו לכם ומנחתם סולת בלולה ושמן 3 עשרונים לפר ו2 עשרונים לאיל תעשו יסרון תעשה לכבש האחד לשבעת הכבשים ושעיר חטאת אחד לכפר עליכם מלבד עולת הבוקר אשר לעולת התמיד תעשו את אלה כאלה תעשו ליום 7 ימים לכם ישרך ניחוח לאדוני על עולת התמיד יעשה ונזכו וביום השביעי מקרא קודש יהיה לכם כל מלאכת עבודה לא תעשו.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu et Torat emet v'chayei olam notaf b'tochenu Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Second Aliyah, page 932, verse 26.
Baruch hu et Adonai hamvarach.
Baruch HaMevorach Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai hamvarach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
אמן ביום הביקורים בהקריבכם מנחה חדשה לאדוני בשבועותיכם מקרא קודש יהיה לכם כל מלאכת עבודה לא תעשו והקרבתם עולה לריח ניחוח לאדוני פרים בני בקר 2 איל 1 7 כבשים בני שנה ומנחתם סולת בלולה ושמן 3 עשרונים לפר האחד 2 עשרונים לאיל האחד יסרון יסרון לכבש האחד לשבעת הכבשים שעיר עזים אחד לכפר עליכם מלבד עולת התמיד ומנחתו תעשו תמימים יהיו לכם ונזכיהם.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam natah b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen.
Yamad. Gedalia ben David Esther.
The third
Page 933, chapter 29, verse 1.
The third Aliyah, we are up to Rosh Hashanah in the liturgical cycle, having gone through Passover and Shavuot, describes it as a day when the horn is sounded, but says nothing about it being the new year or the start of the year. That isn't from the Torah, that's part of a later tradition from the Mishnah, which identifies 4 different days as New Year's, of which Rosh Hashanah is only one, and probably just to avoid the complexity of that, the Torah doesn't go into it.
Baruch Adonai HaMavorach. Baruch Adonai HaMavorach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mechol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. ובחודש השביעי, באחד לחודש, מקרא קודש יהיה לכם, כל מלאכת עבודה לא תעשו, יום תרועה יהיה לכם, ועשיתם עולה לריח ניחוח לאדוני, פר בן בקר אחד, איל אחד, כבשים בני שנה, 7 תמימים, ומנחתם סולת פלולה ושמן, 3 עשרונים לפר, 2 עשרונים לאיל, ויסרון אחד לכבש האחד לשבעת הכבשים, ושעיר עזים אחד חטאת לכפר עליכם, מלבד עולת החודש ומנחתה, ועולת התמיד ומנחתה ונזקיהם כמשפטם, לריח ניחוח ישל אדוני.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chayei olam notah betochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Yamad. Talmud ben Abraham, Hari.
Fourth Aliyah, page 933, chapter 29, verse 7.
Baruch Adonai HaMavorach.
Baruch Nevarach Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai HaMavorach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Le'olam Mihak Asher Bachar Banu B'Kol Ha'amim V'Tananu Et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen.
Amen. וביסוד לחודש השביעי הזה, מקרא קודש יהיה לכם, עיניתם את נפשותיכם, כל מלאכה לא תעשו, והקרבתם עולה לאדוני, ריח ניחוח, פר בן בקר אחד, איל אחד, כבשים בני שנה, 7 תמימים יהיו לכם, ומנחתם סולת פלולה ושמן, 3 עשרונים לפר ו2 עשרונים לאיל האחד, יסרון יסרון לכבש האחד לשבעת הכבשים, שעיר עזים אחד חטאת, מלבד חטאת הכיפורים ועולת התמיד ומנחתה ונזקיהם. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu et Torah emet v'chayei olam natan b'keinu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Five? It's a self-referential problem.
Baruch hu et Adonai hamvorach.
Baruch Le'Barach Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai vorach leolam vaed. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher bachar banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et torato. Baruch ata Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
אמן. וב15 יום לחודש השביעי, מקרא קודש יהיה לכם, כל מלאכת עבודה לא תעשו, וחגותם חג לאדוני 7 ימים, והקרבתם עולה איש ירח ניחוח לאדוני, פרים בני בקר 13 אלים 2, כבשים בני שנה 14 תמימים יהיו, ומנחתם סולת בלולה ושמן 3 עשרונים לפר האחד, ל13 פרים 2 עשרונים לאיל האחד, לשני האלים יסרון לכבש האחד, ל14 כבשים, ושעיר עזים אחד חטאת מלבד עולת התמיד, מנחתה ונזכה.
Joe? Gomel. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch ata Adonai noten haTorah.
Alexander is going to bench Gomel. You can turn to page 173 in the Siddur if you'd like to see both what she's going to say and the response. Not quite sure why she's doing this. There's more than one candidate. Probably
I have
kind of
lots of reasons,
all
but
of
they're
them
all
at
good.
once. HIPAA prevents me from telling you any more, but Gomel on page 173.
Think of the possibilities for conversation at Kiddush. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hagomel l'chayavim tovot shegmalani kol tov.
Mi shigamalcha kol tov, hu yigamelchech kol tov, selah.
Toda rabah.
Shishi. We're up to the 6th Aliyah. The 6th Aliyah, we're in the middle of the offerings for Sukkot. We've already read the first day. We're about to read the rest of the days. And there's an interesting pattern, which is that the number of bulls that are sacrificed on Sukkot differ by day. On the first day we sacrifice 13, but on the second day only 12, and on each day of Sukkot it drops by 1 bull each day. This is not only different from the rules for Passover, when we make the same sacrifice each day, but it may have occurred to you that it contrasts with Hanukkah, where on Hanukkah we light 1 more candle each night. Needless to say, the commentators are in a tizzy over why this way, why that way, something that begs out for explanation. The one explanation I'll mention here is that this is an awful lot of offerings that we're bringing, and there was a suggestion that just the fiscal cost of doing this was so substantial that to keep doing it at its initial level would be more than people were willing to bear. So they backed off a little bit each day to kind of protect the budget, which is a theme I may return to later in my presidency. The 6th Aliyah.
Why have a cow when he's working on instead?
Don't have a count, man.
Hamad Rakava, Abraham David Simcha, Shishi.
6th Aliyah, page 935, verse 17.
Baruch hu et Adonai hamavarach. Baruch Adonai hamavarach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
אמן. וביום השני פרים בני בקר 12 אלים 2, כבשים בני שנה 14 תמימים, ומנחתם ונזקיהם לפרים, לאלים ולכבשים, ומספרם כמשפט, ושעיר עזים אחד חטאת, מלבד עולת התמיד ומנחתה ונזקיהם, וביום השלישי פרים 12 אלים 2, כבשים בני שנה 14 תמימים, ומנחתם ונזקיהם לפרים, לאדלים ולכבשים במספרם כמשפט, ושעיר חטאת אחד מלבד עולת התמיד ומנחתה ונזכה, וביום הרביעי פרים 10 לאלים 2 כבשים בני שנה 14 תמימים מנחתם ונזקיהם לפרים, לאלים ולכבשים במספרם כמשפט, ושעיר עזים אחד חטאת מלבד עולת התמיד ומנחתה ונזכה, וביום החמישי פרים 9 אלים 2 כבשים בני שנה 14 תמימים ומנחתם ונזקיהם לפרים, לאלים ולכבשים במספרם כמשפט, ושעיר חטאת אחד מלבד עולת התמיד ומנחתה ונזכה.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם נוטע בתוכנו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה. The seventh aliyah is page 935, verse 29.
Baruch hu et Adonai hamvarach. Baruch Adonai hamvarach le'olam va'ed. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol hamim, v'natan lanu et tarato. Baruch ata Adonai notein haTorah.
אמן. וביום השישי פרים 8 אלים 2 כבשים בני שנה 14 תמימים ומנחתם ונזקיהם לפרים, לאלים ולכבשים במספרם כמשפט, ושעיר חטאת אחד מלבד עולת התמיד מנחתה ונזקיה. וביום השביעי פרים 7 אלים 2 כבשים בני שנה 14 תמימים ומנחתם ונזקיהם לפרים, לאלים ולכבשים במספרם כמשפט, ושעיר חטאת אחד מלבד עולת התמיד מנחתה ונזקה. ביום השמיני עצרת תהיה לכם, כל מלאכת עבודה לא תעשו, והקרבתם עולה אישי ריח ניחוח לאדוני, פר אחד, עיל אחד, כבשים בני שנה 7 תמימים, מנחתם ונזקיהם, לפר, לעיל ולכבשים במספרם כמשפט, ושעיר חטאת אחד מלבד עולת התמיד ומנחתה ונזקה. אלה תעשו לאדוני במועדיכם, לבד מנדריכם ונדבותיכם, לעלותיכם ולמנחותיכם ולנסחיכם ולשלמיכם. ויאמר משה אל בני ישראל לכל אשר ציווה אדוני את משה.
Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torah emet, v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch ata Adonai notein haTorah.
Amen.
Please rise as the ark is opened for the healing prayer.
Mi sheberach avoteinu mekor habracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who blessed the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Mishaberach Avotenu Avraham, Yitzchak, veYaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, v'Leah, Hu Yivarek Yirafeh et HaCholim. Devorah Shena bat Malcha, Miriam bat Bluma, Elisheva Chaya bat Hilda, Akiva ben Gittel, Miriam bat Malka, Eliyahu ben Malka, Dinsa bat Liba, Liba bat Aviva Susya, Mordcha Avram ben Simcha Bunim, Usher Yosef ben Fega Malka, Yisrael Eleazar ben Yocheved Miriam, Yoreh bat Avraham v'Sarah, Deborah Aviva Kraut. Ve'et kol hacholim b'kahilah hakadosh, hakadosha hazot, hakadosh baruch hu yimale rachamim aleichem, lehachazikim ulerofatam, ve'yishlach lehem refuah shlema min hashamayim, refuat hanefesh, refuat haguf, lechol avrehem, v'gidechem, betoch sh'ar cholei Yisrael v'ha'olam, v'chazek et yedei ha'oskim bitrovehem, Shabbat hi milvaok v'harafoah, krova lavo, hashta bagala uvisman kariv v'nomar, Amen. Misheberach imotenu, Mekor habracha halamotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shalema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen. We remain standing for the half Kaddish.
Yikadal v'yikadash merabah.
Amen.
Yamadi rachmiote v'mikmahote.
V'chayehonu v'yomechon u'chayehon v'Yisrael. V'hakala v'hakala u'bizman karim. V'maru amen. Yeshmera v'mevorach v'yolam ve'al me'al Yiparach.
Yiparach v'shtabak v'arvit roman v'tnaseh v'tadar v'taleh v'talash v'tagorishah.
Brifu
Elam yikol birchata v'shirata.
tushbechata v'nechemata damiran be'alma v'beru amen.
Yamot, Yosef ben Avraham v'Sarah, Machir, Hazak, Machirliah, page 936, verse 35.
Baruch hu et Adonai barak. Baruch Adonai barak le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol elamim v'natan lanu et torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. ביום השמיני עצרת תהיה לכם, כל מלאכת עבודה לא תעשו, והקרבתם עולה איש ירח ניחוח לאדוני, פר אחד, איל אחד, כבשים בני שנה, 7 תמימים, מנחתם ונזקיהם, לפר, לאיל, ולכבשים במספרם כבמשפט, ושעיר חטאת אחד, מלבד עולת התמיד ומנחתה ונזקה, אלה תעשו לאדוני במועדיכם, לבד מנדריכם ונדבותיכם, לעולותיכם ומנחותיכם, ולנזקיכם ולשלמיכם. ויאמר משה אל בני ישראל, ככל אשר ציווה אדוני את משה.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chayei olam natap betochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. take a moment to wrap the Torah, I'd like to thank everybody who's participated in the service thus far. Art Friedson for Shacharit, and for Howard, did you do the whole Torah? No, yeah, Howard did the whole Torah reading this morning. Mazal Tov. And Joe Shang, who is about to be the Maftir. The Haftorah is found on page 938 in the Eitz Chaim. Oh boy, 960.
Haftorah of rebuke.
Oh boy, I tried to spare us that, but all right. If that's where we have to go, that's where we have to go. Hang on a second, I'm getting to it myself. First, Haftorah of Admonition, 968, that's where you want to go? You like that one?
Yeah.
You probably don't, but all right. Anyway, we are coming into the cycle that leads up to Tisha B'Av, which is ultimately leading up to Rosh Hashanah, and in the preparation for the solemn moment of Tisha B'Av, as we ask, why did this bad thing happen to us? We take a few haftarot to reflect on why it might be that, that bad things happen to us and what kind of errors we might make, and particularly thinking about Rosh Hashanah, how we might desist from making those kinds of errors in the coming year. So I'm going to turn things over to Joe. On page 968 for the Haftorah, it's from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 1, going through chapter 2, verse 3.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar b'nivim tovim, v'ratzad b'drechem hanemarim be'emet. Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'torah u'v'Moshe avdo u'v'Yisrael amo u'v'niyeh hamet v'tzedek. Divrei Yirmiyahu ben Chiyahu min hakohanim asher banotot b'eretz Binyamin, asher haya davar Adonai elav b'mei Yoshiyahu ben Amon melech Yehuda b'shlosh esrei shana lemalko, v'yi b'mei Yochiyahu ben Yoshiyahu melech Yehuda Atom aste eseret shana l'Zidkiyahu ben Yoshiyahu melech Yehuda al galot Yushalayim b'chodesh chamishi, vayidav Adonai elai lemor b'terem atzurcha b'veten yidaticha uv'terem tetzeh merachech Hikdashtecha navi lagoim nitaticha, vayomer ata Adonai Elohim hine lo yadati daber ki na'ar anochi, vayomer Adonai elai al tomar nar anochi ki al kol asher ashalachacha telech ve'et kol asher atzacha Tidaber al tiral mifnechem ki itchani l'chatzilecha neum Adonai, vayishlach Adonai et yado vayaga al pi, vayomer Adonai elai hine natati devarai beficha rei. Hivkaticha hayom hazeh al hagoyim v'al hamalachot lintosh v'lintotz ulhahavit v'laharos livnot v'lintoah, vayidav Adonai elai lemor ma'ata roeh Yirmiyahu vayomar Makel shaked ani ro'eh, vayomer Adonai elai hetavata lirot ki shoched ani al devari lasoto. Vayidav Adonai elai shenit lemor ma'ata ro'eh, vayomar sir nafuach ani ro'eh. Ufanav mifnei safona, vayomer Adonai elai mitzafon tipatach הרעה על כל יושבי הארץ. כי הנה קורא לכל משפחות מלאכות צפונני ומרוני, ובאו ונתנו איש כיסו פתח שערי ירושלים, ועל כל חומותיך סביב, ועל כל ערי יהודה. ודברתי משפטי אותם על כל רעתם אשר עזבוני. ויקטרו לאלוהים אחרים וישתחוו למעשה ידיכם. ואתה תזור מותניך וקמת דיברת עליהם את כל אשר אנוכי אצווך, אל תחת מפניכם פן אחיתך לפניכם. ואני הנה נתתיך היום לעיר מבשר ולעמוד ברזל וחומות נחושת על כל הארץ, למלכי יוכרע לשריך וכהנים ולעם הארץ. ונלחמו אליך ולא יאכלו לך, כי איתך אני נאום אדוני לחץ לך. וידבר אדוני אלי לאמור, הלוך וקראת באוזני ירושלים לאמור, כה אמר אדוני זכרתי לך חסד נעורייך, אהבת כלותייך, לכתך אחרי במדבר בארץ לא זרוע. קודש ישראל אדוני, ראשית תבואתו, כל אוכליו ישמו רעה. תבוא עליכם נאום אדוני. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, צור כל עולמים, צדיק בכל הדברות, האל הנאמן, האומר ועושה, המדבר ומקיים, שכל דבריו אמת וצדק. נאמן אתה הוא אדוני אלוהינו, ונאמנים דבריך, ודבר אחד מדבריך, אחור לא ישוב ריקם, כי אל מלך נאמן ורחמן אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני. האל הנאמן בכל דבריו. רחם על ציון כי היא בית חיינו, ללבת נפש תושיע במהרה בימינו, ברוך אתה אדוני. משמח ציון בבניך. שמחנו אדוני אלוהינו באליהו הנביא עבדך ובמלכות בית דוד משיחך, במהרה יבוא ויגל ליבנו, על כיסו לא ישב זר ולא ינחלו עוד אחרים את כבודו, כי בשם קודשך נשבעת לו שלא יכבה נרו לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני מגן דוד. על התורה ועל עבודה ועל נביאים ועל יום השבת הזה שנתת לנו אדוני אלוהינו לקדושה ולנוחה, לכבוד ולתפארת. על הכל אדוני אלוהינו אנחנו מודים לך ומברכים אותך, יתברך שמך בפי כל חי תמיד לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש השבת.
Yishkach.
Yeah, thank you.
We turn back to the Siddur, the prayer book, and we flip to the back cover for the blessings we seek. Source of blessing, our guardian and hope, bless, we pray, all who are dear to us. Watch over them with your protecting love. Bless the people of this congregation, grant them health of body and serenity of spirit. Guide them on the path of Torah and good deeds. Bless our country, our leaders, and our fellow citizens. Keep us faithful to our heritage of freedom and justice. Help us to banish all suffering and strife. Bless our brothers and sisters in the land of Israel. Prosper the work of their hands and minds. Strengthen them and grant them peace. Bless our fellow Jews wherever they may dwell. Comfort those who are in distress. Deliver them speedily from darkness to light. Bless all your children in every land and community. Unite them in understanding and mutual helpfulness. Hasten the day when all can rejoice in a world of peace. We turn back to page 180 for the blessing for the new month, which Howard Middleman is going to do. And I believe we have Michael's going to hold the scroll for us. We rise.
יהי רצון מלפניך, אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, שתחדש עלינו את החודש הבא, לטובה ולברכה, ותיתן לנו חיים ארוכים, חיים של שלום, חיים של טובה, חיים של ברכה, חיים של פרנסה, חיים של חילוץ עצמות, חיים שיש בהם יראת שמיים ויראת חטא, חיים שאין בהם בושה וכלימה, חיים של עושר וכבוד, חיים שתהבנו אהבת תורה ויראת שמיים, חיים שימלו משאלות ליבנו, שימלו משאלות ליבנו, שימלו משאלות ליבנו, לטובה אמן סלה. מי שעשה ניסים לאבותינו, שגאל אותם מעבדות לחירות, הוא יגאל אותנו בקרוב, יקבץ נדחנו מארבע כנפות הארץ. חברים כל ישראל, חברים כל ישראל, חברים כל ישראל, חברים כל ישראל, ונאמר אמן. ראש חודש מנחם אב יהיה ביום שישי, הבא עלינו ועל כל ישראל לטובה.
The new month of Av will begin on Thursday evening and Friday. May it hold blessing for us and for all of the people of Israel.
יחדשהו הקדוש ברוך הוא עלינו ועל כל עמו בית ישראל, לחיים ולשלום,
אמן.
לששון ולשמחה,
אמן.
לישועה ולנחמה, ונאמר אמן.
We continue in our service on page 181 with Ashrei.
Ashrei beitecha odhelu chasela.
Ashrei ha'am
Shekacha lo, Ashrei ha'am
Adonai Elohim.
Tehila leDavid, Aramimcha Elohai ha'melech, v'varcha shimcha le'olam va'ed.
B'chol yom avarchecha v'halala shimcha le'olam va'ed.
Gadol Adonai umhamol me'od, v'ligdolato ein cheker.
Dor ledor yishabak ma'asecha gevurotecha yagidu.
Hadar kevod hodecha, v'divrei niflotecha asicha.
Ve'ezuz norotecha yomeru gedulatecha asaprena.
Zecher rav tuvcha yabiu, v'tzidkatcha yiraneinu.
Chanun berachum Adonai erech apayim ugol chased.
Tov Adonai la'kol v'rachamav al-kol ma'asav.
Yoducha Adonai kol ma'asecha v'chasidecha yevarchucha.
Kevod malchutcha yomeru gvuratcha yidaberu.
Leodia livnei adam gvurotav uvod hadar malchuto.
Malchutcha malchut kol olamim u'memshaltecha bechol dor vador.
Somech Adonai lechol hanuflim v'zokef lechol hakfufim.
Einei kalilecha yisaberu v'yata noten lachem et achlam bito.
Poteach et yadecha u'maspia lechol charatzon.
Tzadik Adonai bechol diracha v'chasid bechol maasav.
Karov Adonai lechol korav lechol asher yikrakru be'emet.
Ritzon yireav yasev yet shavatam yishma v'yoshiem.
Shomer Adonai et kol ovav et kol harshayim yashmid.
Teilat Adonai yidaber pi varecha basa Hashem kachol le'olam va'ed. Anachnu nevarech ya me'ata v'yad olam. Hallelujah.
We rise for the service for returning the Torah, which is on page 183.
Hallelujah et Shem Adonai, ki nizgav Shemo levado.
may be seated. At this time, I am very happy and pleased to welcome Susan Sharfstein to the Bima, who will share with us a few thoughts on the daily portion, weekly portion. Susan?
Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to July. I'm going to begin, excuse me, to share with you some words from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. I will unfortunately not read it with his elocution, so try and hear his voice as I read his words. I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. He continues further down. Let me rush on to mention my other disappointment. I have been disappointed with the white church and its leadership. Of course, there are some notable exceptions. I am not unmindful of the fact that each of you has taken some significant stands on this issue. I commend you, Reverend Stallings, for your Christian stand this past Sunday in welcoming Negroes to your Baptist church worship service on a non-segregated basis. I commend the Catholic leaders of this state for integrating Spring Hill College several years ago. But despite these notable exceptions, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. I do not say that as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say it as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who was nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. I had the strange feeling when I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery several years ago that we would have the support of the white church. I felt that white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be some of our strongest allies. Instead, some few have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. When Rabbi Spitzer asked me to give the Devar Torah this Shabbat, I glanced at the calendar and asked, is that Pinchas? And sure enough, Pinchas. Why is it always Pinchas? Some of you may recall that this is the fourth time that I have spoken about this parsha. I have addressed the dangers of vigilante justice, which I must say have gotten worse in the last decade with the rise of social media and disinformation. I have spoken about religious zealotry in Israel, whose status I would characterize as 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And I have spoken about the Haftorah from Kings that it was tried to have read today, that tells the story of the prophet Elijah that we read on the rare occasions that Pinchas is read before the 17th of Tammuz. And we had a little conversation up here about the reading, about how like every offering ends differently. I may talk about that next time, but not today. Pinchas is a complicated character, and many of the commentators were uncomfortable with his actions. The story is even more complicated as we read half of the narrative in Parshat Balach and the other half in Parshat Pinchas. So I asked Rabbi Spitzer why that was done, and he said that there was a desire not to start the parsha on a negative note, since the part of the story that begins Parshat Pinchas begins with his reward for his zealotry. But I argued, then why not put the entire story into Parshat Balak? In fact, if you read the Plaut and Fox Chumashim, where they are less concerned with following the weekly readings, they both keep that narrative together, which makes more literary sense. So in keeping with that approach, I'm going to focus on one verse that we read last week, which, if you want to follow along, and if you missed last week, is on page 908, verse 6. V'hinei ish mibnei Yisrael, ba v'yakrev el echad, et Midianit, le'enei Moshe, ule'enei kol adat, b'nei Yisrael, v'hema v'ochim petach ohel moed. Just then, a certain Israelite man came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companions, in the sight of Moses and of the whole Israelite community who were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So this verse raises many questions. Who is this man? And why is he not identified by name until the second half of the story when he's dead? Why were the people weeping? We read a few verses later about the plague that killed 24,000, which was stopped by Pinchas's violent act. The plague is presumably caused by God's wrath at Israelites' attachment to Baal Peor, the Moabite god. Is that why the people are weeping? Or is it because Moses has commanded them to impale their leaders to avert God's wrath? Or is it because they regret their weakness at attaching themselves to Baal Peor? Or, as some commentators suggest, that they regret Moses' weakness because Moses cannot rebuke the man because Moses himself is married to a Midianite woman. Is it obvious that the man has brought the woman to have sexual relations with her? Could there be any other reason for bringing her? Erica Brown, in Leadership in the Wilderness, Authority and Anarchy in the Book of Numbers, comments, if the woman being brought to the kinsman of the Israelite man was merely making the acquaintance of family, then the earlier sin of intercourse was being stabilized into intermarriage, a much more harmful outcome for the long-term health of the community. It is one thing to sow one's oats with foreign women in a moment of moral lapse. It is another matter altogether to bring such a woman home to meet the family. An Israelite who brings an idol worshiper to the tent of meeting was uniting two separate and distinct worlds that were meant to be oppositional. In this scenario, it is easier to understand the silence and acquiescence of the audience. A defiant sexual act may be stopped by bystanders. A family meet and greet would hardly warrant such a violent response. What was everyone to do? Why did the people not close in on his brazenness, stopping the act? Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, in commenting on the Israelites passively watching the scene in tears, observes that the sight was so overwhelmingly painful that they had no strength or thought for virile action. In Hirsch, the Pentateuch, the translation and commentary. Others, and this is again Erica Brown's writing, blame their passivity on the fact that there was so much complicity in Shittim that no one could herald righteousness publicly without being labeled a hypocrite. The fact that this particular Israelite crossed an invisible boundary of acceptability mattered less than the breaking of communal boundedness generally. An interesting take. But here's the question, right? Is that the lesson that we should take from this? If we are all complicit in the evil, then is it incumbent upon none of us to speak up? And here, I think, is the greatest sin. The choice to do nothing, leaving a void for zealotry and vigilantism to fill. The entire community watches as this man, who we later learn is the son of a chieftain, brazenly walks in with a woman, not just to have sexual relations, but to engage in sexual relations as part of an idolatrous act. This is not a case of what goes on in one's tent being one's own business. It is not the sexual act that is the sin, but the idolatry in the center of the community which defiles the entire community and their relationship with God. Which brings me back to where I started, with Dr. King's so eloquent admonition to the white moderate clergy about their failure to act and stand up against the evils of racism, for being more cautious than courageous, for remaining silent. This leads to a question that I think we as a community need to ask ourselves. Are we standing up enough for what we believe in? Should we be taking more action as individuals and as a community? I know that many of us have found the last couple of months troubling, to say the least. And while outrage on social media may be cathartic, or not, I question whether it is enough. Many of you were here on Thursday as Stephen Schechter, Zichra Levrona, was laid to rest. While it is not appropriate to eulogize on Shabbat, as Rabbi Bev said, Stephen was a man who practiced what he taught. He was significantly responsible for reinvigorating our Social Action Committee, which has focused on working with Sikkim on hunger and social justice in our community. Our Carrot Festival stuffed the bus drive and aiding refugees. These are unquestionably significant accomplishments. But is this enough? I recall in high school protesting outside the Soviet consulate for the release of Soviet Jews and writing letters to refuseniks. With the rise of electronic communication, lobbying our representatives has become easier. With a couple of clicks, I can send emails to Congressman Tonko and Senators Schumer and Gillibrand on a half a dozen topics in 10 minutes. I can lobby the Israeli government for religious pluralism. But is that enough? Should we, as a community, stand up and protest the erosion of women's rights by our Supreme Court? How do we make sure that the vulnerable and marginalized in our country are not disenfranchised? As our planet burns, are we doing enough to address our impact on climate change? Spoiler alert, as your new facilities VP, I am going to address the fact that you need your winter jacket in the social hall when it is 95 degrees outside. Here's my challenge to you. When you walk out of this room today, pick one issue that you feel strongly about and make a decision to do something more than you have before, more than posting on social media, more than sending emails to elected officials, more than writing a check. And then let's start the conversation about what issues we as a community are passionate about and what we can do to take the next step as a congregation. The stakes are too high. Do not stand idly by and weep. Shabbat Shalom.
Eshkach, Susan, thank you very much for that very inspiring Dvar. We are going to turn to our prayer books to page 184 for the half Kaddish which precedes the Musaf service. Please rise.
Yitgadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah v'yalmad yivrach hirutei v'yamlich mahalchutei v'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayedchol beit Yisrael b'gala uv'izmahan kori v'yimeru amen. Shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam le'omaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yithaleh v'yithalal Shmei Kedusha Barechu li'elam in kol bechata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damihiran b'yolma v'yimeru amen.
The Amidah begins on page 185.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu v'Elohei Avoteinu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzhak, v'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, v'Elohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, V'Konei HaKol, V'Zocher Chazdei Avot, Umevi Goel Livnei B'neihem, L'man Shemo B'Yava, Melech Ozer Poked Moshiach U'Magen, Baruch Atah Adonai, Magen Avraham Upoked Sarah, Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai, Mechaye Meitim Atarav Le'Oshia, Mechalkel Chaim Bechesed, Mechaye Meitim Berachamim Rabim, Somech Noflim V'Rofei Cholim, Umatir Asurim, Kayem Emunato Lishenei Afor, Micha Mocha Bal Givurot, Umido Melach, Melech Meimi, Umechaye, Umatzmiach Yeshua, B'nei Manatalach Hayov Neitim, Baruch Atah Adonai, Mechaye HaMeitim. Na'aritcha v'nakdishcha, Kisot Tziyah Sarfei Kodesh, Hamakdishim Shimcha Bakodesh, Kakatuv Al Yad Neviecha, V'karazel Zeviamar.
Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzavahot, V'lo kol haaretz kevodo.
Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Melech Haaretz Kivodo. Kivodo Ma'alei Olam, Mishatav Shoalim Zeh Lazeh, Aye Mikom Kivodo, Liumatam Baruch Yomeru.
Baruch Kavod Adonai Mimko Homo.
Baruch Kavod Adonai Mimkomo. Mimkomo hu yifen berachamim, ve'yachanam am yachadim shemo, erev bavoker b'chol yom tamid, pamayim b'yavo shema omrim.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hu Eloheinu Hu Avinu Hu Malkeinu, Hu Moshienu, Vehu Yashmienu, Yashmienu berachamav, Shenit, 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 Shenit L'nei kol chai, Liot lachem le'Elohim.
Ani Adonai Elohechem.
Ani Adonai Elohechem, uvdivrei kajacha katuv lemor.
Yimlok Adonai le'olam el ha'ikzion l'dor v'ador, hallelujah.
Yimloch Adonai le'olam Elohai Tzion ledor vador, hallelujah. Ledor vador nagid gadlecha, ulenetzach netzachim kedushatcha nakdish, ושפחה אלוהינו מפינו לרימוש לעולם ועד, כי עמל גדול וקדוש אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני, האל הקדוש.
If you are still davening your Amidah, please continue to do so. Otherwise, please turn to page 203 and join us there for Kaddish Shalom.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבא, ילמד יברכותי וימליך מלכותי, בחיי אחרון ויום אחרון וחיי לכל בית ישראל, בגולה בזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבא מבורך, לעולם לעולמי עלמי. יתברך וישתבח ויתברא ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה שמי קדושה בריחו לעילא מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תשבחתה ונחמתה תאמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. תתקבל צלות הון ובאות הון דכל ישראל קדם אבוהון די בשמיא ואמרו אמן. יש שלמה רבה מן שמיא בחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
Yeshachach, Dan, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Dan for his Musaf leadership, Susan Sharfstein for the Devar Torah. Also, throughout our service, I'd like to thank Dan and Alexander for service coordinating, somewhat on the fly, and also Jeff Shapiro for being our usher and greeter today, along with, you got a little help from the assistant, Jake, there? Good. Thank you, Jake. I would like to take the privilege of announcing that we have a few birthdays in our congregation in the coming week. They include Sadie Goldstein, Michael Friedman, Rachel Goldstein, Dr. Stephen Rappaport, Gary Reich, happy birthday, and Zachary Stone. We also have 2 anniversaries in the coming week, Mr. and Mrs. Emack and Paula Metzger, and Mr. and Mrs. Joel and Tammy Weingarten. If you see any of those people in the coming week, be sure to wish them a happy birthday or a happy anniversary and let them know that they were thought of here at Agudat Achim this morning. We're going to continue with our service. You can do Ein Keloheinu if you want to, or you can jump to Ashrei. It's your choice.
I'll do it. I can.
Perfect. Let's do page 204 for Ein Keloheinu then.
Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadonenu, Ein Kemalkeinu, Ein Kemoshienu, Micheloheinu, Michadonenu, Mikemalkeinu, Michemoshienu, Nodel Eloheinu, Nodel Adonenu, Malkeinu, Nodel Moshienu, Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adonenu, Baruch Malkeinu, Baruch Moshienu, Atahu Eloheinu, Atahu Adonenu, Atahu Malkeinu, Atahu Moshienu, Atahu Shektiru, Avoteinu lefanecha et ketoret hasamim en keloheinu en kadonenu en kemalkeinu en kemoshienu.
We rise on page 205 for Aleinu.
Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol v'atei gedula leotzeh breshit shelo asanu goyei haratzot v'lo samanu k'mishpechot hadama shelo sam elkeinu kahem v'gahar aleinu k'chol hamonam אנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא שהוא נוטה שמיים ועושה ארץ ומושב יקרוב בשמיים ממעל ושכינתו זו Begave miromim, hu Eloheinu einod, emet malkeinu efet zulato, kakatu b'torato, v'yodata hayom, v'achshevota elevavecha. Adonai hu ha-Elohim b'shamayim mimal v'yal ha'oretz mitachat einod help me Kakatu v'toratecha Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed v'nemar v'haya Adonai le'melech al kol haaretz b'yom hahu yeh Adonai echad u'shema Ushemo echad.
page 207. This week we are observing the following yard sites in the community: Louis Carpenter, Edward Kraut, Enrica Pacelli, Helen Siegel, Saul Fine, Jacob Rockower, Salman Wohl, Albert Levy, Sam Tannenbaum, Harry Hallenstein, Samuel Horowitz, Louis Schleifstein, Scott Folsom, Joan Iris Sarot, Irving Aronson, May Cohen, Shirley Morse, Sylvia Kivo Rosen, and Sandra Shapiro. Those who are in mourning, those who are observing that yard site, please remain standing. Join me for Mourner's Kaddish, page 207. Yid Gadal v'Yid Kadash Shmei Rabbah Be'alma Divra Chirute Ve'amlich Malchute B'chayechon U'v'yomechon U'v'chaye Dechol Beit Yisrael Ba'agala U'vizman Kariv V'imru Amen. Yehi
Rabbah Mevarach Le'olam Amei Amaya.
Le'olam Amei Amaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yithaleh v'yithalal shmeid kudisha b'richu la'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechemata ta'amiran be'alma v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya V'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Oseh shalom nimromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Shabbat shalom, everybody. It is at this time that I would like to invite Steve Schmidt, the president of the congregation, to give some announcements. Thank you. Actually, I haven't had a chance to look at these yet, so I may have to select a little bit while we're here. One of the big ones, on Monday, there's going to be a library meeting. We're going to meet in the library, although we'll also have a Zoom connection, and we're going to think a little bit about what the priorities should be. We have the great fortune of having way more books than we can currently store in the library, so we're going to think about what needs to stay on the library and what needs to be moved to storage somewhere else. We're generally trying to think about ways to make the library a more useful place, to bring back some of our in-the-building functionality that we lost through the pandemic. If you want to join us in person, you're welcome. We'll stay on the Minion link after Minion, so you're welcome to join us that way as well. If you have views about the library but can't make the meeting, you're welcome to email me, and those will go into the discussion mix as well. Things happening this week. Shabbat is out at 9:07 today for Havdalah. Lots and lots of Hadar programming still happening online, and some JTS programming as well. Certainly encourage people to find our calendar of online programming, which you can get from the website, and be sure to check out as much of that as interests you, which I hope will be much of it. Not a whole lot else happening this week because we are kind of in that high end of summertime. The thing I do want to emphasize is that after 2 Shabbats from now, we will reach, because of all these Haftarot of admonition, Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is going to fall on Saturday night and Sunday this year. We will have a program and a pre-fast light meal on Saturday night, the 6th of August. That's going to be include a study session for Tisha B'Av that will be led by Rabbi Spitzer on his return from Israel. I suspect his time in Israel will have inspired him to have something particularly interesting to say. Fast begins at 8:09. We'll do evening services. We'll read Lamentations, which is a very moving experience. If you have not done that before, I would encourage you to come in and join us for that. It is one of those things that is just a little more effective in person than it can possibly be on Zoom. And then we'll also have morning and afternoon services on Sunday the 7th for Tisha B'Av. That'll do for today. The online announcements are available if you'd like to read more. And I think at this point we can turn things back over to Dan for Adon Olam.
Adon Olam Asher Molach B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra Li'et Naso B'chefzo Kol Azai Melech Shemo Nikra ואחרי ככלות הכל, לבדו ימלוך נורא, והוא היה והוא הווה, והוא יהיה בתפארה, והוא אחד מן שני, להמשילו להכבירה, בלי ראשית, בלי תכלית, ולא ההוד והמשרה. והוא אלי וחי גולי, בצור חבלי ביצרה, והוא ניסי ומנוס לי, מנת כוסי ויום אקרא. בידו אף כי רוחי, בעת אישן ויעירה, ואם רוחי גביעתי, אדוני לי ולא אירא. אדון עולם אשר מלך, בטרם כל יציר נברא, לעת נשא בחפצו כל, אזי מלך שמו נקרא.
Yishkalakan, thank you very much. I don't have a Kiddush cup up here, so we won't do that up here, but I encourage everybody to join us for Kiddush in the social hall. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, God, please.
With you.